Hi, today we're going to be looking at how you can hear God's voice. I'm Don Egan and this is the Portable Jesus. Lots of people want to know how to hear God's voice. They want to do what God tells them and be faithful. I don't mean like some psychopath who hears voices and goes and does something stupid, but people, spiritual people who want to hear what the God they follow says, what Jesus says, and follow that in their life and looking for direction. So here's the thing, how to hear God's voice, or the way I'm going to explain it today, is probably not the way that you would think of hearing God's voice. So let's get into it. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, Luke tells us that Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. So let's just put the context of that around it. So Jesus had been a carpenter. He'd become 30 years old and he stopped doing carpentry and he joined John the Baptist out in the wilderness, and he's baptized by John the Baptist. So this looks like this is the start of the 3-year ministry of Jesus. So you'd think, hey, come on, let's get on. We've been baptized, God's spoken, the heavens opened, we heard the voice of God say you're anointed, you're the Son of God, let's go. But that's not what Jesus does. And that's not what the Spirit leads Jesus to do. What it leads him to do is to go off and withdraw from everyone else, to go to a place of solitude and silence. And I really believe that if you want to hear from God, this is a really good way of listening to the voice of the Spirit in your life. I understand extroverts especially might have a problem with this, but this is what Jesus did, and we're followers of Jesus, so let's follow his example. I believe that this process that Jesus is taking part in here, of hearing God's voice and doing what God says, has 3 particular steps. The 3 steps are withdrawal, encounter, and vocation, or mission, the last one. So number 1, let's look at withdrawal. The Gospels tell us that Jesus went off into the wilderness for 40 days and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. Now don't get too hung up on the 40 days, because if you understand the Jewish storyteller's culture, you'll realise that this is a signal to the reader, and the first readers of the Gospels were obviously Jewish. They would have understood this number 40, and numbers quite often in the Bible, they carry a significance. They're not really so Jesus may have done more than 40 days in the desert, he may have done fewer than 40 days in the desert, but this is what it means. If you look at where the number 40 comes in the scriptures, you'll see it's always attached to a difficult trial or preparation period. So you'll see, for example, in the story of Noah, it rained 40 days and 40 nights. So what the storyteller's telling us there is that for Noah, it was a difficult trial that he went through, and it was long and protracted and went on. That's what the number 40 means. Then you've got Moses. You remember when he murdered the Egyptian, he then ran off to live in the desert and ended up herding sheep around the desert for 40 years. It was a long and difficult period in his life. When he leads Israel out of Egypt and they're free, he leads them into the wilderness for how long? For 40 years. Meaning that the 40 years in the wilderness for Israel was a long and difficult trial for them. And so you get the picture that when Luke says that Jesus went into the desert and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, the introduction of the number 40 is really telling us that this withdrawal was a long and difficult trial. And quite often, depending on how much you like silence and how much you're at ease with your own company, the withdrawal part of this process can be a long and difficult trial. Now, it works differently at different times and for different people. For example, sometimes just going off and spending a day in silence and solitude, withdrawn, triggers something in us, and we hear some sort of direction from God, not in our ears, but in our spirit, and then we can move forward. So it doesn't always have to be at 40 days or 40 years. On the other hand, you've got people like St. Anthony, who was the father of monasticism, the monks and nuns thing. He went off on his own for 14 years. And he was in the desert for 14 years seeking God and fighting with his own demons. Not that he was possessed particularly, but that he was fighting with the inner struggle that we all have. But St. Anthony's 14 years in the desert gave birth to modern monasticism, and all the convents and monasteries that we have today are really rooted in his 14 years of solitude out in the desert. We need to withdraw because we need to get away from distractions. God rarely shouts to us over the noise of modern life. We need to create some space where we can hear from the living God. I love this quote from Mother Teresa about silence. We cannot find God in noise and agitation. Nature, trees, flowers and grass grow in silence. The stars, the moon, the sun move in silence. What is essential is not what we say, but what God tells us and what he tells others through us. In silence, he listens to us. In silence, he speaks to our souls. In silence, we are granted the privilege of listening to his voice. Silence of our eyes, silence of our ears, silence of our mouths, silence of our minds. In the silence of the heart, God will speak. Silence of the heart is necessary so you can hear God everywhere. In the closing of the door, in the person who needs you, in the birds that sing, in the flowers, in the animals. If we are careful of silence, it will be easy to pray. So we listen to God when we withdraw through the thoughts of our mind, although we try to clear our mind of the thoughts about the things we've got to do, the jobs that are outstanding and that kind of thing. And then nature around us, where we are, and in our withdrawal, things that might happen there. All these things can speak to us and bring God close to us. A couple of years ago, I decided to withdraw for a couple of weeks. And I actually went on a drive down to Land's End and then drove all the way up to John O'Groats and then back down to Suffolk. So it was a journey of 2,700 miles, more or less. And I've written about it in a book called Pilgrim's Digress, which is available on Amazon and all good bookstores. But the thing is, it was during that 2 weeks of being alone in the car when I met people on the way and things that happened on that journey. One day God spoke to me on that journey, and what God said to me kind of resulted in me making these videos today and the creation of the Portable Jesus YouTube channel. So if you want to see how it can work out in practice, actually my little book's not a bad story. It's quite interesting to read. It's got good reviews. So if you just want to read the story, it's good. But you'll see in the process of just withdrawing and almost forgetting that you've gone to hear God, then God may speak. So that's number one, withdrawal. And at some stage, often when you have forgotten that you were going out, because you can't make God speak to you. You can't force that. You can't. There's no point reading lots of the Bible or praying a lot and saying a lot of words. It doesn't work like that. God will speak when God is ready to speak and you are ready to listen. So withdrawal is the first thing. And the second stage, somewhere in that withdrawal, somewhere in that 40-day, it doesn't have to be 40 days, but that number 40, the long extended trial that's difficult to go through, the withdrawal. Somewhere in that process, you may hear the voice of God. Not audibly, you won't hear it with your ears, but speaking to your spirit inside. And it'd be like an idea that's come from somewhere else. But once the idea has come into your head, it seems so obvious that this is what you should do. And a new energy comes, and then you begin to think about how you're going to do that thing. At some stage in the solitude, we have some sort of encounter with God. For me, on the Pilgrim's Digress journey, that drive around Britain, it came one morning as I was just waking up, and I had a verse from the Bible in my head, but then it felt like God said something additional to that verse from the Bible. And it was, like I said, it was an idea coming from somewhere else, not my idea. And it was obvious once the idea had formed in my mind. So with the encounter, it can't be forced or manufactured. It takes time, and it often comes as a surprise, often comes when you've forgotten that you'd gone into the solitude and the withdrawal to hear the voice of God. You'll be thinking about something else. Then we come to the third stage of this process. So we've withdrawn, we've had the silence, we've had the extended period of being alone, solitude, silence, and at some point in that, God, we feel, has spoken to our spirit or given us a new, fresh revelation. That was the encounter. Now what comes is the vocation or mission. Coming out of that word, we process that word that we've heard. What does this word mean for us? And then that's what brings about the vocation and the mission. And I would say at key points in my life, this is what happened. When I first came to faith and started following Jesus, almost immediately, I lost my job. And although I went to the job centre almost every day looking for work, I just couldn't find a job. And I was unemployed for a year, exactly a year. And in that time, I used to go on walks and I was seeking God and listening to God. And God was doing things in my heart during that time. And then suddenly a job came, and it was like at the interview, it was like nobody really interviewed me, and then I got the job and I was in the right place at the right time. And then from that job, I began thinking about my future, and again withdrew, took time to be silent and listen to God and reflect, read the scripture, just give God space to speak. And out of that came a call to ministry. That was 30 years ago. I've been in ministry 30 years. And then later on, when I was already in ministry, I was a bit like a round peg in a square hole. So again, I had periods of withdrawal and silence and seeking God. And out of those times came a word that we need a new wineskin. Now, I don't know about wineskins. I don't live in that culture when wine was put in skins. It's in bottles these days. But I understood the story and the parable of Jesus, that you can't put new wine into an old wineskin, otherwise it splits. So what I felt God was saying at that time is, I need a new vehicle for my ministry. And so I founded a charity with some friends, and RSVP Trust was born. That was 25 years ago. So we've been going 25 years. And when times have been hard, you can look back and say, well, I don't know what's happening right now, but God called me to do this, because I went away, I withdrew into silence and silent prayer. I had an encounter with God, and from that I believe that God spoke to me to do this ministry. And so you continue in that calling. At certain times in your life, there'll be significant moments where you need God to speak to you again about the next season of your life. And this is a great process. It doesn't speed it up, but it's certainly a lot better than trying to hear God with all the noise and the clutter that we have in our lives. You're just not really going to hear God unless you make the effort. There's so many people today rushing into ministry. They might get baptized or have some encounter with God, be converted, and then say, yeah, I'm going to have a ministry. God's called me to do this, or he's called me to do that. And it's very difficult to find in their stories this thing that Jesus did. So Jesus got baptized. If anyone could have charged into ministry, it must have been the Son of God. But Jesus didn't do that. He had 40 days in the wilderness, this long and difficult trial, in silence and in solitude, withdrawn. He couldn't get famous in the desert. He couldn't do the miracles in the desert to impress anyone because nobody was there. But in that time, it's clear that he heard from God, because when he comes back, he comes into the synagogue and begins his ministry with this great announcement: the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to open the eyes of the blind and preach good news to the poor, and all that message. So he announces his mission statement on day one when he comes back. But had he not got into the wilderness, he may not have been as confident about that mission statement, and things would have gone very differently. I know lots of people find being silent difficult and being away in solitude, away from everyone else. But see it as a seed of faith that you plant in good soil, and give it time, and the seed eventually germinates and something wonderful begins to grow. So I know silence is difficult for many people, but this is the pattern of Jesus: withdrawal, encounter, then vocation or mission. Withdrawal, encounter, and then the mission. So how about you? Have you had an encounter like this with Jesus? Where do you hear the voice of God the most clearest? A couple more things before I go. I mentioned my book, Pilgrim's Digress, which you can find on Amazon. I'll leave a link in the description below. I also want to just recommend this book, Finding Your Hidden Treasure, by Father Ben. I found this book really, really helpful. This is a guy, a monk who's spent, years in silent prayer and contemplation, and this is a great book. If you're unfamiliar with silent prayer and contemplation, this is a great book, and I can't recommend it strong enough. I will put a link to this book in the description down below. So if you found this video helpful, please give us a thumbs up on YouTube and click the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.